Good morning. Welcome to our webinar. This is NDE, NILA, and CLTA Special Interest Group K-12 guest speaker series. Today we have Janet Ackerson from University of Nebraska Kearney to present on heritage language learners, engaging heritage language learners. Janet, could you introduce yourself and take it off?
Sure. Thank you, Crystal, for the invitation. I'm actually here at Crystal's invitation to talk specifically about this topic because she was asked for someone to speak on this topic in this series. So I'm happy to be here to talk about engaging heritage language learners, which is, I think, a little different focus than just talking about instructional strategies or talking about curriculum. If we're talking about engagement, I think there's some different things we need to talk about. So we're going to talk about engaging heritage language learners in both mixed and dedicated heritage language classrooms. So I'm speaking to you as a Spanish professor and methods professor at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, but I come from sort of 15 years of high school experience teaching not exclusively, but primarily Spanish to heritage language learners. And that is also primarily what I do teaching undergraduate Spanish as well. It's my area of professional sort of interest in terms of pedagogy besides language teaching methods. So I'm excited to be here to talk to you about it. And I'm going to talk to you about it both from sort of my scholarly perspective, but my perspective as a practitioner. So welcome. Let's get started. I would love if you would drop in the chat, since I see I know some of you already, of course. Introduce yourself to everyone else here in the chat. Like, who are you? Where are you? Are you working with heritage language learners? Let's see who's here. So if you have the chat open here, say hi, everyone. Do you have any experience working with heritage language learners? Where are you located? So everybody knows who's here if you're here. Say hi, Elliot's here. And there is everyone. Hello. So when we talk about working with heritage language learners in mixed or dedicated classrooms, we're really talking about students who grow up in homes speaking the target language, right? Whether we're teaching courses that are exclusively for those students, like is the case of Spanish for Spanish speakers instruction, which would be the most common heritage language taught in the US. But of course, there are heritage language programs for other languages, not as common here in Nebraska. Oh, hi, Anna is a heritage language teacher. Yeah. Wonderful. But it is particularly common since it's not possible in all contexts to have a large enough population of heritage speakers to be offering courses specifically for heritage language learners. It's pretty common for them to show up sprinkled in our regular language courses, and that presents a sort of different kind of challenge. So it's likely that over the course of our time teaching, no matter what language we teach, we might encounter this experience of heritage language learners in mixed classes. Because that's what happens in contexts when we don't have large populations of heritage speakers. So hi, everybody. Great to have you here. We have got some goals for today. These are our session objectives. We're going to start by talking a little bit about kind of who are heritage language learners. And you may be really familiar with this, you may not be. We're going to talk a little bit about approaches to placing students and the role of the instructor and how that impacts engagement of heritage language learners. We're going to talk about engagement as it relates to curriculum. We're going to talk about engagement as it relates to specific practices that you might employ in your classroom. And we're going to talk about engagement in terms of community building. So I've got some different areas to focus on in our presentation today. So we're starting off here to make sure we're all kind of sharing understanding of what a heritage language learner is, or who a heritage language learner is, and how they might be different from second language learners. So just in terms of language proficiency. So I want to point out that there are different definitions of what counts as a heritage language learner, which range from individuals who identify an ethnic or cultural background related to the language of study, but are not actually proficient users of the language. We're looking at, and that might be a broad definition of heritage language learners. Today, we're talking about heritage language learners in a more narrow sense, to say students who were, as Valdez's kind of classic definition explains, learners who were raised in a home where the language was spoken and have a measurable degree of proficiency in that language, and who are to some degree bilingual in the target language and English, right? So that's who we're understanding heritage language learners today as students who have proficiency in the target language that they acquired at home. And in that case, they typically have proficiencies that are different from second language learners. And some of the things that characterize this difference between heritage language learners and second language learners you can see here. We know that there will be huge differences in the receptive capabilities of a heritage language learner compared to a second language learner. So heritage language learners typically have very strong oral proficiency, so listening proficiency, that far exceeds what second language learners are typically able to do as they're learning. They also tend to have extensive vocabulary repertoires, but that are defined by their experiences in the home and the community, and not by schooling experiences. So they have a different selection, a breadth of vocabulary, but that is contextually limited to their sphere of heritage language use at home. They'll have a wide variety of different literacy skills. Some heritage language learners will know how to read in the heritage language. Others will not. Some will have had experience writing, others will have not. But typically the experience of heritage language learners is to not have had much access to formal instruction in the heritage language. And so they may have literacy skills that are not grade level with native speakers of their age, right? Because they've missed out on the opportunity to develop those literacy skills through schooling. And of course, and really importantly, when it comes to engagement, heritage language learners have insider knowledge of the culture and of the pragmatics of appropriate interaction in the target language that L2 learners may never have, right? So they bring some unique advantages to the study of language for that reason. And of course, they have intuitive knowledge of grammar rather than explicit knowledge of grammar. So they can produce the forms, but they don't know what they're called, and may have trouble eliciting specific forms rather than responding naturally and communicatively to prompts. So how this impacts engagement, right? The degree to which our classroom is designed with specific proficiency strengths and weaknesses is going to be clear to students, right? The degree to which the classroom is designed to meet the needs of students with very limited vocabulary, the degree to which it's designed to treat students as cultural outsiders in the exploration of culture is going to impact engagement. But I want to start with, beyond the linguistic differences, to really talk about some effective and motivational differences between second language learners and heritage language learners that are related to motivation, right? So second language learners, the target language is not a part of their identity in most cases. They may be more or less motivated to study the target language. And we know among like US secondary students, the degrees of motivation of second language learners are highly variable, many of whom are taking language classes because they need it for college or because they have to, right? That we have these motivational profiles of second language learners that are really variable, and sometimes not conducive to their engagement in class. But if we think about what motivates heritage learners to study the target language, it's very different, right? Second language learners might be studying a language to be college ready, or maybe because they want to travel, or because they think this will help them with college, right? Or because their mom told them to, or something like this, right? They're instrumental motivations. But heritage language learners may be studying a language to communicate better with family members, right? They may be studying a heritage language because they've been told by members of their family or their community that their language isn't good enough, right? Or isn't correct. They're really different socio-affective situations in the classroom. And how a heritage learner or a second language learner may respond to feedback about the accuracy of their language is really different, right? The degree to which they'll perceive the teacher as an expert is also very different too. If I come from an insider cultural and linguistic background and I perceive the teacher as coming from an outsider linguistic and cultural background, that may impact my engagement, right? So understanding how heritage language learners are situated already as real users of the language in their communities and acknowledging that expertise is really important for engaging students in class. So keeping the idea of the affective experience of heritage language learners in class is kind of key to understanding how we engage them. So it's not just a question of better meeting the linguistic needs of heritage language learners in the classroom in order to engage them, which is important, right? Because we can't engage students with instruction that doesn't help them develop their skills. But we also really need to be thinking about what the affective experience, the emotional experience of language learning is like for heritage language learners, what the social experience in the classroom, what the relationship with the teacher and with the curriculum is, and what it feels like when we talk about engagement of heritage language learners. So keeping that big idea in our mind, right, that heritage language learners are going to have a different experience socio-effectively in the classroom is important when we talk about engagement. And so we think about how to create experiences that are going to feel good to heritage language learners, right, and going to positively impact their motivation is important. And that's going to have to do with building relationships between the heritage language students and other students in the classroom, with the teacher, with the curriculum. All right, so I'm just going to say this a couple times loud for the people in the back, that we cannot engage students with intermediate, mid to high proficiency in classes that are designed for novices. One more time, heritage language learners with intermediate, mid to high language proficiency in a level 1 language class will not be engaged. That is not a problem you can solve. Just going to say that again, right? So appropriately placing heritage language learners outside of novice courses is the first step to solving engagement problems. I am asking teachers to teach a level 1 language class that has 5 or 6 heritage speakers that have intermediate level proficiency is not asking them to do the possible. It's asking them to do the impossible. You're asking someone to teach 2 different classes at the same time. And so when we're talking about teaching heritage language learners in mixed classes, we're not setting instructors up to be successful engaging heritage language learners if their heritage language learners are mixed in to students with no language proficiency or with very limited novice level proficiency. if we're talking about heritage learners in the narrow sense, students who have demonstrable proficiency in the language, they shouldn't be placed in beginning level language classes. And how to solve that problem is going to depend on the context that you're working with, right? At the level of a large school system, there may be ways to screen students, to administer placement exams before they even get to your school building or to your classroom. In smaller contexts, the stakeholders may just be a counselor. They may be talking with the administration, talking with the high school counselor about how to correctly place heritage language students, how to identify them, and start them in a level 3 class, right? As opposed to a level 1 or a level 2 class. And how to solve that is really going to depend. In a really small context, you might just have students show up the first day and say, oh, this isn't the right class for you. Let's move you over to this higher level language class. And really, the way that you'll solve that problem will depend on what kind of school district that you're working in, but it's really important to solve the placement problem, is to figure out if we have heritage language learners who have real ability to communicate in the target language. My kind of bar has always been, if students can understand everything that I'm saying to them in the target language, right? No difficulty comprehending my oral language, and are able to participate in extended conversations at the sentence level, they are already far beyond what a student in a level 1 or level 2 language class in a traditional second language instruction program can do. And so they really need to be in a higher level class. So it has always helped me in talking with stakeholders to use English language learners and English language arts as an example. So if I'm having conversations with counselors and they're having a hard time understanding why it's so important for me to move this student out of this beginning level Spanish class into a higher level class, we say, we would not let a native English speaker take a class for an English language learner, even if they wanted to, even if they thought it would be fun, even if they need an easy A, or all of the many reasons why students, counselors, parents might argue that the heritage language learner should take your level 1 class. It's typically helpful to understand that we do not place, no matter what their reading level might be, or no matter what the student might want, we do not place English language arts students in classes for English language learners in our school system. And so when we help make that analogy, that often helps stakeholders understand why we want to do this change in placement. So I want to say that's the first step to engaging heritage language learners. If we haven't gotten them out of novice classes, that's the first step. Okay, the other kind of big idea I want to introduce in terms of engaging heritage language learners has to do with the teacher identity in our interaction with heritage language learners. And I want to talk about that in terms of thinking about moving from an identity as the teacher to an identity as a coach. And so I want to talk about what a coach is like and why that's important in thinking about how we approach our interaction with heritage language learners, especially when we're not native speakers of the target language, right? When we feel like our language proficiency, so I know that many teachers who are second language speakers of the target language might feel like that heritage speakers are going to challenge them, right? Or do challenge them on their language proficiency or their authority in the classroom because they're not native speakers of the language. And that's a real reality. But I want to say one of the ways that we can avoid those situations is repositioning ourselves from the role of teacher, which presumes the teacher as the expert facilitator of learning, right? That the teacher is the expert, the students are the novices, and it is the teacher's job to create instruction that reveals to the students, right, what the teacher knows. And that's, right, sort of what we think of when we think of teaching. But I want to sort of highlight these ideas from a definition of coaching that might be helpful for thinking about engaging heritage language learners. So, coaching focused on assisting individuals in achieving their own goals and maximizing their potential, right? So, not the teacher's goals, the student's goals, right? Overseeing a task and occasionally providing feedback on how to perform it more efficiently, right? So occasionally feedback, not correction, feedback, right, on performing the task more effectively. It's not telling you exactly what to do or how to do it. It's providing feedback on how you do it. Yeah. Performance analysis, encouragement, and feedback. Yeah. Personalization, thinking of ways to engage the individual. Coaches who work with athletes approach different individuals differently. And I put a star by this last one because a coach understands that part of their role is to motivate individuals, right? That the job of the coach is to help maintain and cultivate that motivation. We don't often think of teachers in that particular role, though I'm going to argue I think that we should for a lot of different reasons. We often think of motivation as something that is the student's responsibility. And we say, oh, this class, it's so challenging. They're just so unmotivated. And when we say things like this, we're communicating that motivation is the student's responsibility. So it's the student's responsibility to be motivated or not be motivated. And sometimes we even talk about that as if it were an essential characteristic of the human that we're talking about, right? That they're just unmotivated, as if that is a characteristic that we can't change, right? That's a fixed attribute. But I want to argue that if we see our job as a coach, as a cheerleader, as a motivator, and we approach the work that way, we're going to succeed in creating more engagement because we're taking some responsibility for motivating students, thinking about what will increase or decrease motivation, and talking explicitly with students about motivation, if that makes sense. Because we know motivation has an incredible impact on language learning for second language learners as well. And so cultivating that motivation is a huge part of generating engagement. I also think, particularly with heritage language learners, that approaching the work as a coach to say that I'm here to help you build your language proficiency in ways that you want takes away the idea that I need to be the expert. And if we think about coaches, great basketball coaches don't have to outrun their athletes. They don't have to be better shooters. They don't have to be better basketball players than to be incredible coaches. And so thinking about what coaches do to gain the respect of the players that they coach can inform a lot of thinking about what we need to do to engage our heritage language learners who we may feel have more language proficiency than we do in some cases, or at least more cultural knowledge in that case. So that's a kind of big idea I want to take away. I want you to take away from this particular presentation is to think about the degree to which we set ourselves up to be a coach in the classroom. Another kind of big idea here is to shift our thinking from approaching heritage language learners in mixed classes, primarily from the view of the impact they have on our second language learners, right? So we may have the tendency to see the heritage language learners in our second language class as an opportunity to tutor our second language learners, or to edit or provide feedback on the work done by our second language learners, or to see them as such a great opportunity for the second language learners to have great practice listening to heritage language learners, native speakers speak, or how wonderful to use them as cultural informants. So we can say, oh, um, tell us more about how this is done in Mexico, or how this is done in China, right? As cultural informants for the benefit of our second language learners, right? Um, there's some deeply kind of problematic things here, and I want to say from a kind of almost civil rights perspective, that the heritage language learners in our mixed classes are not there for the benefit of our second language learners, and we really need to be thinking about how what we're doing is benefiting both groups, right? And also acknowledging from the affective experience of heritage language learners that heritage language learners may feel a great deal of anxiety about their own language proficiency and don't feel comfortable or qualified to be an editor or a tutor. They may also resent that, like, not my job, not my problem. And in some ways it's not, right? And they may feel embarrassed with the role of cultural informant. I can be a heritage language learner and heritage speaker of a language and never having visited the country my parents are from, right? I may not have intimate knowledge, and that may embarrass me in front of my peers. I may feel uncomfortable about that. And asking me to play those roles in the classroom may not be comfortable for me at all, and are not likely then to have a positive impact on my engagement in the class and my motivation for participation. So just want to understand that doesn't mean that we don't have heritage language learners who relish the idea of being a cultural informant, right? There are learners who do want to play that role, and they usually make themselves known to us in their behavior in class, right? And some may be very keen to play an editor role, but that we're not making the assumption that that's the role that heritage language learners are going to play in our classroom is really important to engaging them. So that's another kind of big idea in thinking about engaging heritage language learners that I want us to take away from today. All right, so now let's get into some specific ideas around curricula. So I don't want to disappoint anybody today that I'm not going to sort of hand out an activity like, if you do this, this activity will engage your heritage language learners, because that engagement is going to be really contextual, and that fundamentally knowing your students is the key to unlocking their motivation and their engagement, because students as individuals have different interests and different reasons for wanting to engage in the study of the target language. And that goes for both second language learners and heritage language learners, that surveying student interests and talking to students about their goals and using that to build curricular experiences is a hugely powerful tool for creating engagement, is responding to student interests, to what students want to learn about. And I know that that's not always realistic, that we have curricula that have themes that we have to follow, but the degree to which we have flexibility within approaching how that theme is addressed, or choosing the kinds of texts or projects that we're doing with our students. And we all have some agency in that regard. That the knowing about what our students are interested in and what their goals are can help us make strategic choices. Yeah. The other thing that tends to be engaging for heritage language learners is representation of their identities, communities, and experiences in the curriculum. So heritage learners of Spanish, for example, are often very engaged in learning about Spanish speakers in the United States, the cultural products, practices, perspectives of the target language community within the United States, whether that's music, history, foods, celebrities, that come from the heritage language community. And it's incredibly valuable, I think, to make heritage language communities visible for second language learners as well, because just as we're moving away from calling the study of many of the languages that we teach as foreign languages, because we acknowledge that they're community languages spoken by individuals who are members of US communities and maybe our very own community. It's not a foreign language, right? It's a community language, and making the language as a community language visible in the curriculum and connecting to local language speakers, places, practices in the heritage language community, both in the United States from a macro perspective, but in our local community in the curriculum is a way to engage both heritage language learners and second language learners, and can't encourage that enough in terms of designing curricular experiences that make visible the language speakers here that are in our community. The other sort of degree to which we can make instruction engaging for heritage language learners and just offer the opportunity for differentiation in some ways. If we look at our curriculum and imagine going deep rather than wide with our themes. So let's take food, for example, because everyone teaches food at some point, and maybe even multiple times. We might teach it in level 1 and we might come back to it because we know food engages, right? Everyone loves food, and it's a cultural practice and product that's really visible and familiar and inviting, right? So if we're teaching about food, we often go wide and we're like teaching a bazillion different foods, all the words for all the foods in all the food groups, and maybe all the food preparation things. I'm going to suggest we go deep and we look very contextually at street food, right? Or at food from a very particular place, right? And we really go deep in learning about, right, that we have some content that is going to be engaging to learn about rather than this wide breadth of vocabulary for naming every single food, so that we can do some deeper examination and give ourselves time to really unpack some products, perspectives, practices, and that's going to offer the opportunity to differentiate and to engage when we give time for investigation and things like that. So engage in curricula deep instead of wide when it comes to themes. So we really contextualize. We're not just talking about everything about the environment. We're contextualizing that with a particular issue of renewable energy in a region, right? And we're going deep into that topic study. We're going to create more engaging experiences for everybody. And the last sort of curricular piece is, I think, again, relevant for both heritage language learners and second language learners, but of particular relevance for heritage language learners. If we're thinking about curricular outcomes and assessment practices that move toward project and performance outcomes, particularly when they have real audiences for students' language production. So if we can set up, often we're creating presentational communication assessment experiences and thinking about how to turn those into presentational productions for real audiences. it is again going to invite the differentiation that we need in mixed classes, but allow students to leverage their strengths and do more when they're able, and creating that opportunity for heritage language learners, because we need challenge. We need to be able to show our talents to be engaged. And so thinking about projects as our outcome, and when we can get them in front of real audiences, even better, right? So if students need to, let's go back to the food example. If students need to write a recipe in order, to demonstrate their learning, because we've taught them commands and food preparation and all of these sort of things, really bringing those recipes together into a cookbook, right? That looks beautiful, that is put together, and that we give to our parents, that we share to a community organization, that we sell to raise money for something, that we translate so that it's bilingual and showcases the richness of diversity of recipes in our families, and we disseminate that to people. That is engaging curriculum. That's going to motivate higher quality work from our students, and give our heritage language learners an opportunity to shine. So there's an example. Yeah, so I'm afraid I can't just say, here's a unit that will engage all of your learners, because thinking contextually about how to employ these ideas with your particular students in the particular teaching context that you are in, is a local problem to solve, right? But we solve it in understanding our students, right? Learning about what they like, and learning about our local community and what those opportunities to engage that community and create products for those audiences might be. Okay, I want to pause right here for now, because I've been talking for a good half an hour or more, and just ask if anybody has any questions sort of right now before I go to the next part of this.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
Here, I can put my screen. My sister and mom are in the background. Just don't mind them. Okay, so kind of like the discussion you had about like having heritage learners in the classroom, and where like depending on like where you're at within the school, district, or community, you can place them in a different area. What if like you don't have control over that and you do have them in the class? Like, what do you do to like make steps to just make that work?
So I would argue, like, yes, inevitably this may happen, but that, like, want to encourage you that to sort of, or embolden you in your agency to really fight against that happening, and to talk to everyone that you can about why that shouldn't happen. But then I think acknowledging with the student, so talking about talking with the student, saying, like, look, this is not ideal, right? My job here is to help everybody grow their language skills. What are some of your goals, right? How can I help you meet some of their goals? What sort of things do you think would help you meet your goals? And can we imagine you doing some independent activities, right, that help you meet those goals with my support, in addition to some things that we're doing in class? And I'm going to talk here in just a minute a little bit about heterogeneous versus homogeneous grouping, but you could have different scenarios depending on who that individual was. You might have people saying, oh, I'm happy to just do something totally independently the entire time. That's my dream. I want to read books. I want to do whatever, like that can happen, has happened to me. Or there might be people saying, I really want to work on my writing skills, right? Or I've always wanted to learn more about X, Y, or Z. And how can we set aside some time when I'm doing something that really is inappropriate for heritage language learners, like learning very basic vocabulary they already know? How can they be engaged in acquiring thematic vocabulary related to this that is relevant to them, right? Or can they create a material through their own investigation that they can share with everyone else, right? Can they be an informant. And I think you can devise different solutions depending on the individual person that is in your class and what their goals might be. But to sort of position yourself as to say, we know this is not ideal for these reasons, but it's still my job to help you grow your skills. How can we make that happen? What are some of your goals? What do you feel like would be comfortable?
That makes sense. And like, so it's kind of just making like a general like lesson for everyone, but then like individualizing like your conversation with that person, like, hey, what can I do to help you? So that they're still like gaining something from it. But like, yeah, I feel like because I don't have experience with that, I feel like it'd be hard to figure out how to balance that just so that it's not taking away from everyone else and like the general lesson. So I think that'll just come from like, yeah, the individual student and like experiences. So
yeah, and I'm going to talk next about some structures you can use in the classroom that allow you the opportunity for different people to be doing different things. So that's setting up a classroom where everyone's not always doing the same thing all the time is a great way to set up the opportunity for, accommodating students with different language proficiencies. Anybody else have something they're like thinking about right now?
I actually did. My fiance is Hispanic, and he was in the room when you were talking about heritage learners are not. And when you said the heritage learners are not like a good opportunity for practice, he was like, yes, because he in high school he went to a really small school and he had to take novice 1 and novice 2 Spanish, and he was like, I did not enjoy, and yeah.
Yeah, and really kind of resent being asked to sort of be the conversation partner sometimes, right? Like I'm
Yes.
supposed to be here to learn something, and instead I'm like sort of doing the teacher's job of listening to these other students talk who aren't helping me learn, right? And not all heritage learners are going to feel that way, but it's a perfectly normal way to feel, right? And to understand why that would be not motivating to them is, I think, yeah. Okay, we're going to have another chance to ask some questions here at the end. So I'm going to keep moving, but I wanted to make sure I've been talking for a while. If there's something that you were just burning question thinking about, that we got a chance to talk about that. All right. Okay. So I want to specifically talk about inquiry approaches to culture in our curriculum as a huge opportunity for engaging heritage speakers. So heritage speakers have different degrees of knowledge of the target language culture. And when they do have language of the knowledge of the target language culture, it doesn't mean that they have like universal knowledge of the target language culture. And they often have very great curiosity about the rest of, sort of outside of their small community, the rest of the target language community in other countries or in the larger diaspora, right? So culture is really an opportunity to engage all students. Cultural difference is interesting, but heritage language learners are often very motivated to learn more about the target language culture beyond their home community culture. And some want to know more about their home community culture, about their own cultural heritage, particularly if they've not traveled or had the opportunity to travel to where their parents were born or where their cultural heritage is from. So culture is a huge opportunity for engaging, and the more we can sort of make the instruction about that while we're learning language, the better chance we're going to engage people, I think, too. So an inquiry approach to culture focuses cultural learning on cultural comparison, where we're both examining US culture and the target culture at the same time and setting up opportunities to do that cultural comparison. And heritage language learners can be amazing at this because they often have the experience of feeling between cultures and can look at US culture from both an insider and an outsider perspective, which can be really challenging for second language learners sometimes to see US culture from an outsider's perspective, and we can bring that perspective to them through, YouTube videos or through authentic texts that take out outsiders' views of US culture and bring them to US students. But heritage language learners have really important skills sometimes as intercultural individuals who navigate a space in between the target culture in the classroom, or who feel as if they have, one foot in one culture and one foot in another, that's often a characteristic way that heritage language learners describe their own cultural identities. And so they really can shine in the opportunity for these cultural comparisons and can help second language learners see US culture from the outside, which I know we said they're not cultural informants, because we're not asking them to provide factual information about, say, Hispanic culture, but we're using their skill as an intercultural person to help us see the outside. And that's really an opportunity for them to shine and for us to appreciate that interculturality that they have. They also, can help us have insider perspectives on target language culture as opposed to outsider perspectives, and setting up the space in our classroom where we are often doing this cultural comparison really invites heritage language learners to do what they're good at. Another really important way to look at culture and use inquiry approaches is to emphasize the heterogeneity of cultures, right? To say within US culture, within Mexican culture, within Chinese culture, there are cultures, right? Not all people from X place do Y thing, right? And not everyone in the US does this or thinks this or has this, and emphasizing that and inviting students to explore that heterogeneity is engaging. It's interesting, and it helps everyone develop important intercultural skills and perspectives that lead to the kind of outcomes that we all as language teachers really want. When we talk to language teachers about what their goal for students are, of course they say, learning to communicate in the target language, but all of us feel really deeply about the power of language study to open students' minds to cultural diversity, and using inquiry approaches to culture are what help us actually achieve those outcomes, is helping students approach cultural difference with a mindset of curiosity and interest in cultural difference. So when we say inquiry approaches to culture, we're talking about students as investigators of culture. So we're setting up like ACTFL's image module, and that's a whole separate presentation about what inquiry approaches to culture are, but saying that those image models, the OC model, setting up cultural activities where students are discovering cultural products and practices, that we're not telling students this is what the target culture is like, where students are doing the work of interpreting cultural artifacts, asking questions about why the target language might be like this, why we might do these things, and why is it that we do these things in this way exactly? And what does that say about US culture? These are the kind of skills that actually help students achieve those mindset outcomes that we really want from language instruction. So learning about inquiry approaches to culture and leveraging that in the curriculum is huge for engaging both second language learners and heritage language learners. And heritage language learners often have deep interest and curiosity in cultural learning and talking about culture, and have a unique capability often to engage in that inquiry and model those intercultural behaviors, seeing from both an insider and an outsider the target culture. And so it's just a huge opportunity for everybody to view culture in the classroom in that way. Okay. So then the other big theme in heritage language learning and in the idea of mixed classes, but I'm just going to say differentiation looms large in the heritage language dedicated classroom as well, because the experience of heritage language learners is so variable and they come with such different experiences of literacy, the degree to which they have been able to employ their language skills and receive input in different contexts is incredibly variable. And so the need to differentiate for different language proficiencies is huge, both in mixed classrooms and in an HL dedicated classroom as well. So the kind of theory of differentiation and instruction kind of comes down to 3 and sometimes 4, and I'll mention that, different kind of places where we can differentiate. So we can differentiate content, like what we are learning about, right? Or what the material is that we're working with. We can differentiate that. So I can say, L2s, you're going to read this, and HLs, you're going to read that, right? That's differentiating the content. And that's what we often think about when we think about differentiation, right? I say, this is your vocabulary list, and this is your vocabulary list. That's differentiation of content. But we can differentiate in other ways, right? We can differentiate in process, right, of what we are going to do in order to do this, right? So we all have the same content, but you're going to do something different with it than you are. Yeah? And that might come into play when we're talking about the complementary proficiencies of second language and heritage language learners, right? That second language learners often really need to work on their speaking, and heritage language learners really need to work on their writing, right? So we might all be working with the same stuff, but we might be doing something different to practice, kind of thing. And finally, the product, what we produce to prove that we did the learning might be different, right? So different opportunities to differentiate, and different approaches might be different in different contexts, or with a different set of content objectives or products. And so asking ourselves the question, like, if I feel like I'm going to have to tweak something that I have planned here to make this work better for my diverse group, what does it make the most sense to differentiate, right? Is the problem the content? Is the problem the activity, what we're going to do to practice? Or is the problem the outcome or the product? And where do I want to make that change? It's a nice frame for thinking about it. There's a fourth kind of element of differentiation, where the learning environment, where we might be differentiating the learning environment. It's not something that comes into play, or we don't often have the capability of changing the learning environment in our classroom. We're all there in the classroom, and I may not have the ability to change anything about that, but that's another thing we can think about, that I could change the context of the learning. All right, so I want to talk about some practical strategies for engaging heritage language learners in terms of what we're doing in the day-to-day classroom. And I put up here in orange in the top right corner, this whole telling students why is an engagement strategy up and down the field for everyone, and particularly for heritage language learners. Telling students why we're doing what we're doing in terms of how it will help them reach their goals, develop their language proficiency, is crucial to engaging folks. Not just what we're doing today, but why we're doing it and why we're doing it this way. It's like bringing students in to see why you've made the choices that you've made about the instruction really can help them buy into what you're doing. If they see a purpose to what we're doing in terms of the outcomes, how it will help them learn, that's really engaging for everyone. So I want to start with that. And that's a kind of day-to-day easy thing to start doing tomorrow, is not just telling students what we're going to do today, but why we're going to do it that way. Yeah. And I think that plays into a bigger model of coaching. So I'm going to like flip back over to this, to the left-hand side, and start to move up to that orange spot on the slide. It's to say it fits the idea of coaching, of supporting motivation by having students set goals, having them self-assess, giving performance assessments that help students see their growth, and telling them why what we're doing is going to help them meet those goals is all motivating and kind of helps position us in the role of coach, right? And help the students take ownership for their learning and support their motivation, right? So if I tell students why we're going to do this way, right, that can give us buy-in for doing it. But if I see how it connects to a goal that I've set, and I have an opportunity to evaluate myself and get feedback on that self-evaluation the way a coach would, right? That's providing encouragement, right? Pointing out what I've done well, in addition to offering me some suggestions about how to improve my performance the next time. That's what a coach does, and that's feedback that's motivating, right? So looking at our performance, so that's a kind of practical strategy for thinking about engaging all learners, but particularly for helping us be a coach to heritage language learners. All right, so then if we set up a classroom, and I mentioned this in response to Eve's question before, that if we set up our classroom as a place where different people are doing different things all at the same time, it will be easier to differentiate. And so there are some just regular teaching structures that help us create a classroom that is a place where different people are doing different things on the regular. So Jigsaw is one way that we do this. And I can start with an expert Jigsaw group where everyone has a different text that has a different level of difficulty. And I can have my heritage learners with a more difficult text. And I can go further and say, you know, I can match those expert groups to their proficiency level with the texts. And then I put them in a mixed group and they all teach each other, right? And that's a structure that just invites my ability to differentiate. And so if I do that often, I have a built-in strategy for differentiating the content. If I set up stations in my classroom, right, where, you know, there's a different activity at each of these 4 or 5 stations, I can give students a dance card, you know, that says, well, you need to do stations 3, 4, and 5. You need to do stations 1, 2, and 3, right? You need to do stations 2, 4, and 5. And if that's a regular part of what I'm doing in the classroom, I can differentiate for my students, my heritage language learners, through creating a station that's particularly designed for them and ensuring that they're going to make it to that station, but not a station that's really focused on second language learners. And I know stations feel insane. Like, how could I be making 5 different activities every day? That's crazy. But if you set up some standard stations, so something like story cubes or you know, word walls where you're using them, or you have a series of like describing pictures, things that are really low prep activities, to be standard stations that every time you do stations, those come out. And then you're really only designing specific activities for the targeted lesson for a couple of the stations. So anyway, there's an idea to make stations a little less worky. Things like web quests, where students are gonna complete a task by visiting a variety of websites. We can tier the difficulty of those websites and send different students to different sources of information to, again, differentiate the text difficulty or which authentic texts our learners are engaging with. Things like choice boards, where students are presented a menu of activities they can complete, with an idea that you must do one from this column, one from this column, one from this column, but you must do one from this column and two from that column, another opportunity for that kind of thing. Other structures like literature circles, where students are in small groups working together on different texts, can be an opportunity to differentiate the experience and the kind of conversations that are happening about the texts by creating groups based on proficiency level. But if we're routinely using these kinds of structures and it becomes normal in our classroom for not everyone to be doing the same thing at the same time, we'll get better at managing behavior in those contexts. We'll be able to teach the expectations for how the classroom works, how you get the teacher's attention, what the teacher will be doing, what I need to be doing, if we do that often. And so if we teach students how to work in a classroom where different people are doing different things, I mean, this is a hallmark of the elementary classroom. And somehow we forget how to do this in the secondary classroom sometimes, that we don't all have to be doing the same thing at the same time for the classroom to work. And so preparing classroom environments where different things are happening is great. Learning activities that allow us to personalize our learning, like KWL charts, where students can have their own questions, dialogue journals, where students write back and forth to each other or to the teacher, can invite the opportunity for heritage language learners to show off their capabilities and for the kinds of conversations to develop through those exchanges to kind of push their proficiency level through engagement with the teacher. Free voluntary reading is another personalization activity in the classroom that invites us to differentiate, and how students will respond to their reading in those kinds of contexts, support the opportunity to differentiate. And then the last bit is thinking about cooperative learning, both in the heritage language classroom and in the mixed classroom, creating different opportunities for homogeneous and heterogeneous grouping options based on the kind of activity that we're doing is really important, and varying that. So there are times when we want to homogeneously differentiate students, like the jigsaw example of offering harder texts, more challenging, more appropriate texts to students with higher language proficiency. Absolutely a situation where we might want to homogeneously distribute. Heterogeneous grouping would be more appropriate in situations where we want to pair students with complementary strengths so that they can support each other. Like we gave the example of the second language learner needs to speak and the heritage language learner needs to write. And if we can put them together in a context where, like a running dictation, where the second language learner runs to the other room and tries to memorize a phrase, and they come back and tell their heritage learner partner how to write it down, right? And provide them feedback on the correct spelling because they saw it, but they have to speak to do that. But the heritage language learner has to do the writing. Like, this is a great example of why a situation where a mixed pair would be the right grouping. And so I want to offer a tool for like quickly getting into these kinds of groups. So here's another hallmark of the elementary classroom, are grouping cards, where every desk might have, or every student might have stuck to their folder one of these cards. And if I say, get into your A group, I know that that's going to create a group that is homogeneous in terms of language proficiency. If I say, everybody get into your number group, I know that's going to give me a group that is heterogeneous because of how I've assigned these cards. If I say, get into your shape group, I know that's going to give me a pair that's homogeneous. if I say get into your weather group, that's going to give me a pair that is heterogeneous, right? So setting up at the beginning, and students may not even realize, right, that that's how you're doing the grouping, but you have a go-to way to set up groups in the classroom when you say, okay, I want you to turn to your partner to talk about, and I really want it to be a homogeneous or a heterogeneous group. I can just say, use your letter partner, use your number partner. I'm also going to drop into the chat this link that's right here. I put this on here so I wouldn't forget to do this. Escape, here we go. I'm going to drop this in the chat for you. This is a whole presentation really about this idea of homogeneous versus heterogeneous grouping with L2s and heritage learners. And it's from Maria Carrera, who is, a guru. She is the executive director of the American Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese, but she's a professor emerita of UCLA and the Heritage Language Research Institute there. And it's a great presentation that really explores more the idea of complementary proficiencies with heritage language learners, and encourage you to check that out for thinking more about when you would do this. The last thing I'm talking about today here is just the idea of creating a supportive community. And that involves creating a space where we're validating heritage speakers' experiences and their language varieties. And that means not seeing heritage language learners as underdeveloped native speakers, right? Or not good enough yet speakers of the language, but really validating the heritage language experience and the language they speak as good enough, appropriate in our classroom, relevant to our classroom, right? And that's huge. And really supporting students in terms of motivation, and this goes back to the idea of coaching, that they understand themselves and their language proficiency. They understand what they're good at, their glows and their grows, and they understand what they need to be working on. And they feel like the teacher in particular, and hopefully the other students in the class, and thinking about how we build those relationships between students where we all understand each other's strengths and weaknesses and what we're working on and why, right? And understand how we'll get better at it, right? And why we have these strengths and weaknesses. And in the case of heritage language learners, that often means absolving them of the responsibility in the sense that they're often told, right, that their language isn't good enough, often even by members of their own community, and to help them understand that that's not their fault, right? That not having had access or opportunity to schooling in your heritage language is not your fault. And the reason that your spelling is not good is not because you're a deficient human being. It's because if no one's spelling is good if they don't go to school, right? In the language that they're trying to spell in. And so I think absolving heritage language learners of sort of responsibility and helping them look critically about how society in some cases has denied them the opportunity to develop their heritage language, and that's not their fault, right? Is, I think, really important also. Yeah. So part of that supportive community is creating cultural comparison through inquiry and everybody feeling like they're working together to develop their skills and to broaden their understanding of the world, and know that we're all sort of works in progress in that way, that teacher included, is, I think, really important to creating the supportive community that heritage language learners need. And really those critical approaches where we talk about people's attitudes toward Spanglish, for example, right? Or toward the language proficiency of US born heritage language speakers, and look at the experience of celebrities like Carol G or Selena, who are representatives of that in between language proficiency and cultural identity space, to help heritage language learners see how those individuals have navigated people expressing ideology, language ideologies about their language being insufficient, and kind of validating that experience and helping them see society's views of heritage language from critical perspectives. And I think that's part of being a supportive community too. Okay, we are past 11 o'clock here, and I want to make sure we have time to ask some questions. And yeah, so that's what I've got for today, talking about engaging heritage language learners. I'd love to know if you have other questions, thoughts, things you want to talk about.
Thank you very much. I already get very positive feedback for your presentation in private chat.
Oh, well, thanks. That's great. I mean, I hope it's helpful since you asked me to talk about this. I'm glad. I hope that whoever asked for it got exactly what they were looking for, right?
Yeah, it's helpful. Thank you. Any questions?
Hi, Lena. How are you?
Hi, good to see you. This is very relevant to our grad class readings this week, so I'm glad I'm here. I was wondering if you could talk more about the differentiating of learning environment, and how we can, like what you mean by that and how we can adjust that for our heritage kids.
Well, and I don't think that that's like a realistic, I'm just saying this is like from the literature in differentiation. They're talking about like, well, somebody could, some student could be doing this project in the library while someone else is here, or somebody could be doing this online while someone else is in person or something. And I don't think that's a realistic proposition in most secondary contexts. Like in the secondary comprehensive high school, I do not have the option of like not having the students there in the room with me doing the work.
Right.
If you feel me. I mean, we just don't have flexible learning environments like that. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So which is why I kind of am like, I don't know, right?
Right. Nice. Okay, thank you. Just making sure I didn't miss something.
Yeah.
Okay, one more thing. If you need a PD certificate, please put your name and your email in the chat so that I can send you the certificate as soon as I can. Maybe after our meeting, maybe in 20 days, depending on how busy I am.
Terrific.
Any other questions? This is really good. Thank you.
All right. Well, I mean, I hope that nobody is disappointed that it's not like there's like an answer to engaging heritage language learners, right? It's not like if you do X activity or, do Y thing that everyone will be engaged, because, we all know that motivation is such an individual experience, right? That like what motivates us is different for unique people, but kind of acknowledging that and really assuming responsibility as the teacher for motivating students is going to go a long way to engaging students, right? Like if I understand that I have to work to motivate them, and I have to think about how what we're doing in the classroom is going to motivate or demotivate, like accepting the teacher responsibility instead of just saying these students aren't motivated, and that's why this doesn't work. I think is going to go a long way for creating engagement. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no fixed answer in education, but you gave us a lot of great ideas. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope so. And thank you for joining me here on a Saturday morning. I know it's not, we've all had
a game day. Yeah, a game day.
Your dedication, right, to being here learning on Saturday morning. Like, okay, with that said, we should be done, right? And everyone can go on and enjoy the rest of their weekend.
Thank you. If there's no more questions, thank you very much for attending Janet, thank you for presenting. I
My
really appreciate it.
pleasure. My pleasure. Good to see everyone. Take care.
Take care and let's enjoy our rest of the weekend. Thank you.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Well, yes, thank you, Crystal, for the invitation. It was great fun.
Yes, thank you. I already have teachers feedback in Chinese. She's saying, this is amazing.
Well, good. I'm glad. So yes. And if whoever asked you to have me talk about this was not here, please send them the recording. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Have a nice weekend. Thank you.
You too. Bye now.
Bye.